The key turned in the lock with a familiar click, and I stepped into the house I hadn't seen in months. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, a scent that instantly brought me back to childhood. Home. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the silence, or the way the sunlight filtered through the blinds, but the atmosphere felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Julian. Caleb's voice came from the kitchen, soft and tentative, like he wasn't sure it was really me. Yeah, it's me, I called back, dropping my bag by the door. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, leaning casually against the frame. God, when did he grow up? His lean frame filled out the simple white tee he was wearing, and his dark hair was mussed, like he'd just rolled out of bed. But it was his eyes that caught me off guard, bright, intense, and fixed on me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're here," he said, smiling. It was the same smile he'd always had, but there was something different about it now. Something that made my chest tighten. "I said I would be, didn't I?" I replied, trying to sound casual, like the sight of him hadn't just thrown me off balance. He shrugged, his gaze lingering on me for a beat too long. "Yeah, but you've been busy. I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "Of course I came," I said, stepping closer. "You're my brother." The word hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. Caleb's smile faltered for a moment, but then he recovered, gesturing toward the kitchen. "Come on, I made coffee." We spent the evening like we always did, talking, laughing, reminiscing about the past. But there was a tension between us that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just in the way he looked at me, though that was part of it. It was in the way he sat just a little too close on the couch, his knee brushing against mine. In the way he leaned in when he spoke, his voice low and intimate. "Remember when we used to sneak out to the lake at night?" he asked, his eyes lighting up with the memory. "Yeah," I said, smiling despite myself. "You almost fell in that time because you weren't paying attention." He laughed, a warm, familiar sound that made something in my chest ache. "And you pulled me back. You've always been looking out for me, Julian." His words were innocent enough, but there was something in his tone that made me pause. Something that made my stomach twist in a way I wasn't ready to examine. "That's what big brothers do," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Caleb's smile faded, and he looked down at his hands. "Is that all it is?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I mean, you've always been more than just my brother. You're everything to me, Julian." His words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning I wasn't sure I wanted to unpack. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, waiting for a response. "Caleb," I started, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to process what he was saying, what he was asking of me. "I know it's not normal," he said quickly, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's messed up, but I can't help how I feel. I've tried to ignore it, to push it down, but it's always there. Every time I see you, every time you're close to me, it's like I can't breathe." His honesty was raw and unrelenting, and it left me speechless. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this wasn't right, but the truth was, I didn't know what I felt. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me, that stirred something deep inside me, something I'd been ignoring for a long time. "Caleb," I started again, but he interrupted me, his voice desperate now. "Just don't say anything, okay? Not yet. Just let me have this. Let me be honest for once." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He took a deep breath, his eyes searching mine for something, acceptance, understanding, I wasn't sure. "I love you, Julian," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just as my brother. I'm in love with you." The words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I should have been angry, or confused, or disgusted, but all I felt was a deep, aching pull toward him. "Caleb," I said again, my voice breaking. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, and I could feel the heat radiating off him. His breath was warm against my skin, and I could smell the faint hint of coffee on his breath. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice trembling, "but I can't help it. I can't stop wanting you." I didn't know who moved first, but suddenly, his lips were on mine, soft and tentative, like he was afraid I might pull away. And for a moment, I froze, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 reasons why this was wrong. But then something inside me shattered, and I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. It was desperate, messy, and everything I'd been trying to ignore for so long. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. "Julian," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and hope. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what this meant or where we would go from here. But for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. "Caleb, I..." He looked at me, his eyes wide and vulnerable, waiting for me to say something, anything. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just stay with me," he said, his hand reaching up to cup my face. "Please." I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch, my mind swimming with 1,000 conflicting emotions. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't walk away from this. I couldn't walk away from him. "Okay," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll stay." The house was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that felt both familiar and foreign. I woke up early, my mind still tangled from the night before. Caleb's confession played on a loop in my head, each repetition leaving me more unsure of where to place my feet. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, my fingers gripping the sheets like they might anchor me to something solid. "Caleb loves me, not just as a brother." And I let him kiss me. I told him I'd stay. The thought sent a shiver through me, one that wasn't entirely unpleasant. I stood, pacing the room, my body restless with a tension I couldn't name. My reflection in the mirror caught my eye, tall, messy-haired, with a shadow of stubble on my jaw. I looked like I hadn't slept, and I suppose I hadn't, not really. My dark eyes seemed to hold more questions than answers. When I finally left the room, I found Caleb in the kitchen, humming softly as he made coffee. He looked up as I entered, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe, or hope. His hair was tousled, his lean frame wrapped in a hoodie that hung just slightly too big on him. There was an openness in his face, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "Morning," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Morning," I replied, my own voice sounding rougher than I intended. I leaned against the counter, watching as he poured a cup of coffee and handed it to me. His fingers brushed mine, and I felt that same electric pull from the night before. I sipped the coffee, grateful for something to do with my hands. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes were searching mine. "Yeah," I lied. "You?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not really. Too much on my mind." I didn't ask what. I was afraid to. Instead, I focused on the coffee, the warmth of it grounding me even as my thoughts spiraled. We stood there in silence for a moment, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Caleb was the one to break it. I was thinking, maybe we could go for a walk, like we used to. I nodded, relieved for the distraction. "Yeah, that sounds good." We headed out, the morning air crisp and cool. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under our feet. We walked side by side, our shoulders brushing occasionally. It felt familiar, but there was a new tension now, an undercurrent that I couldn't ignore. "It's weird being back," I said, breaking the silence. "Everything's the same, but different." "You're different," Caleb said, glancing at me. "Not in a bad way. Just you've changed." "So have you," I replied. "You're not the kid I left behind." He smiled, but there was something sad in it. "I'm glad you see that." We walked for a while longer, the conversation drifting to safer topics, old memories, plans for the week. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me, his gaze lingering just a little too long. It made my heart race in a way that was equal parts thrilling and terrifying. When we got back to the house, Caleb paused at the door, his hand resting on the knob. "Julian," he said, turning to face me. "About last night. I meant what I said. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, but I don't want to push you. I need to know if you're okay." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I could see the worry in his eyes, the fear of rejection. It hit me then, how much courage it must have taken for him to tell me how he felt, to risk everything for a chance at something more. "I'm okay," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "It's just a lot to process." He nodded, his expression softening. "I get that, and I'm here, no matter what you decide." His words settled over me like a weight, warm but heavy. I reached out, my hand brushing against his, and for a moment, we just stood there, our fingers entwined. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant, like a line had been crossed that we couldn't uncross. That evening, we found ourselves on the couch, a movie playing in the background that neither of us was really watching. Caleb was sitting close, his leg pressed against mine. I could feel the heat of him, the way his presence seemed to fill the space around me. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. But there was a part of me that just wanted to let go, to stop fighting whatever this was between us. "Julian," Caleb said softly, his voice pulling me out of my thoughts. He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "Do you ever think about what it would be like? If we weren't us? If things were different?" His question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if that changes anything." "It could," he said, his hand reaching up to brush a strand of hair from my face. "If you let it." I stared at him, my mind racing. I wanted to argue, to tell him that it wasn't that simple. But the way he was looking at me, his eyes full of hope and longing, left me speechless. Before I could think better of it, I leaned in, my lips brushing against his in a kiss that was tentative at first, but quickly deepened. His hands were in my hair, pulling me closer, and I could feel the intensity of his emotions in the way he kissed me. It was overwhelming, but it also felt right. Like something that had been building for years had finally come to the surface. When we pulled apart, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. "Julian," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. "Tell me this isn't just me. Tell me you feel it too." I closed my eyes, my heart aching with the weight of his words. I don't know what I feel," I said, my voice breaking. "But I don't want to stop." He let out a shaky breath, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw. "Then don't," he said. "Just stay with me." And in that moment, I knew I couldn't walk away, not even if I wanted to. Because no matter how complicated this was, no matter how much it scared me, I couldn't deny the way he made me feel. Like I was finally, truly seen. So I kissed him again, letting myself fall into the unknown. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped thinking about what it all meant and just let myself feel. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. I stirred awake, the weight of Caleb's body pressed against mine, a stark reminder of the night before. His breath was steady, his head resting on my chest, and for a moment, I allowed myself to just be. To feel the warmth of him, the way his presence seemed to anchor me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. But as the silence stretched on, the reality of what we'd done began to creep in. My mind raced, thoughts colliding like waves against a shoreline. What does this mean? Where do we go from here? I glanced down at Caleb, his face peaceful in sleep, and felt a tug in my chest, a mix of affection and something else I couldn't quite name. Carefully, I shifted, trying not to wake him as I slipped out of bed. The cool floor beneath my feet grounded me, and I grabbed a shirt from the chair, pulling it on before heading downstairs. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy with unspoken words and lingering tension. In the kitchen, I started the coffee maker, leaning against the counter as I waited. The familiar hum of the machine filled the space, a small comfort in the midst of my swirling thoughts. I poured myself a cup and sat at the table, the steam rising in gentle curls. I didn't hear him approach, but suddenly, Caleb was there, standing in the doorway. He looked at me with those earnest eyes, his hair slightly mussed from sleep. "Morning," he said softly, his voice still rough. "Morning," I replied, my throat dry. He moved to the counter, grabbing a mug and pouring his own coffee before sitting across from me. The silence between us was thick, charged with everything we hadn't said. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked finally, his gaze steady on me. I nodded, wrapping my hands around my mug. "Yeah, you. Better than I have in a while," he admitted, a small smile tugging at his lips. But then it faded, replaced by something more serious. "Julian, about last night." I stiffened, my grip tightening on the mug. "Yeah." He looked down, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. I need to know if you're okay. If we're okay." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know, Caleb. I don't know if I can be okay with this. It's a lot." He nodded, his expression somber. "I know, and I'm not asking you to figure it all out right now. I need to know if you're willing to try, to see where this could go." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the vulnerability in his eyes. The way he was laying himself bare, trusting me with something so fragile. And despite the fear churning in my gut, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the way he made me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. "I don't know what this means," I said softly, "but I'm willing to try. For you." His breath hitched, and for a moment, he just stared at me. Then, slowly, he reached across the table, his hand finding mine. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt some of the tension in my chest ease. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We sat like that for a while, the silence between us no longer heavy but comforting. Eventually, he stood, pulling me to my feet. "Come on," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Let's get out of here for a bit." We ended up at the park, the sun warm on our skin as we walked along the path. The air was crisp, the leaves starting to turn, and it felt good to be outside, away from the confines of the house. Caleb was quiet beside me, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It felt natural, like we didn't need words to understand each other. At one point, he stopped, turning to face me. "Do you remember when we used to come here as kids?" he asked, his eyes soft with nostalgia. I smiled, nodding. "Yeah, you'd always try to climb the big oak tree, even though Mom told you not to." He laughed, the sound light and carefree. "And you'd always be there, ready to catch me if I fell." The memory brought a warmth to my chest, and I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "I've always looked out for you, Caleb." He caught my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "I know, and I've always admired you for that. You've always been my rock, Julian." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "Caleb." He stepped closer, his free hand resting on my chest, just above my heart. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm just asking you to be here, with me." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing under his touch. "I don't know if I can give you what you need." "You already are," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "Just by being here, by trying, that's enough for me." I felt something shift inside me, a crack in the walls I'd built around my heart. And before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his. It was soft, hesitant, but filled with all the emotions I couldn't put into words. He kissed me back, his hand sliding up to cup my cheek. The world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of us, lost in the moment. When we finally pulled apart, I rested my forehead against his, my breath shaky. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's okay," he said, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "We'll figure it out together." We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other, before continuing our walk. The sun was starting to set by the time we made it back to the house, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. That night, as we sat on the couch, Caleb leaned against me, his head resting on my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around him, pulling him closer. The TV was on, but neither of us were really paying attention. Instead, I found myself focusing on the way his body fit against mine, the way his breathing seemed to sync with mine. "Julian," he said after a while, his voice quiet. "Yeah. Do you think this could work?" There was a vulnerability in his tone that made my chest ache. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. But then I looked down at him, at the way his eyes held a mixture of hope and fear, and I knew I couldn't lie to him. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm willing to find out." He nodded, his fingers tracing patterns on my chest. "That's all I can ask for." We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of our unspoken words hanging in the air. But for the first time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt possible, like maybe, just maybe, we could navigate this uncharted territory together. As the night deepened, Caleb shifted, turning to face me. His eyes were dark, filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Julian," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah." He hesitated, his hand resting on my chest. Can we just be together? Like this? Just for tonight?" I felt my heart skip a beat, my throat dry. "Caleb, I know it's a lot to ask," he said quickly, his eyes searching mine. "But I need to know, Caleb." I repeated, my voice softer this time, almost a whisper. His hand was still pressed against my chest, the warmth of his palms seeping through the fabric of my shirt, spreading through me like a slow, steady ache. I could feel the thump of my own heartbeat beneath his fingers, erratic and unsteady. "I don't know if." He cut me off, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You don't have to know. Not right now. Just stay with me. Here. Like this." His words were pleading but steady, as if he'd rehearsed them in his head 1,000 times before this moment. His vulnerability was raw, unfiltered, and it clawed at something deep inside me, something I wasn't ready to name. I exhaled slowly, my chest rising and falling beneath his hand. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and something else, something more that I couldn't quite pin down. But looking at him now, his expression so open, so honest, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "Okay," I said finally, the word leaving my lips before I could second guess it. Just like this. His shoulders relaxed, and the tension that had been coiled in his body seemed to melt away. He let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding, and the corner of his mouth twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my chest tighten in a way that was equal parts comforting and terrifying. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low and thick with emotion. His hand slid down from my chest, coming to rest on my waist. It was a simple gesture, almost casual, but it sent a shiver racing up my spine. We sat there in silence for a moment, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. The weight of what we were doing, what we were becoming, hung over us like a storm cloud, threatening to break at any moment. But for now, we stayed like that, our bodies close enough to feel the heat radiating between us. "Do you remember?" Caleb began, his voice breaking the quiet, "when we were kids and we'd share that old sleeping bag in the backyard?" I chuckled softly, the memory washing over me like a warm wave. "Yeah, you'd always say you were scared of the dark, but I think you just didn't want to sleep alone." He smiled at that, a real, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe I just like being close to you." His words struck a chord, and I felt my throat tighten. Was he always this honest? I wondered. Or is this something new? Either way, it was disarming, and it left me feeling off balance in a way I wasn't used to. "Caleb," I started, but he shook his head, cutting me off before I could finish. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't overthink it, Julian. Just be here with me. That's all I'm asking." I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. "Okay." We spent the rest of the evening like that, talking and laughing, the tension between us ebbing and flowing like the tide. It was strange how easily we slipped back into the old rhythms of our relationship, but with this new undercurrent running beneath the surface, a current that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. When it got late, we moved to the couch, sitting side by side with our shoulders brushing against each other. Caleb reached for the remote, flipping through channels until he found something to watch, but I could tell his attention wasn't really on the screen. Every so often, I'd catch him glancing at me out of the corner of his eye, his gaze lingering for just a fraction of a second too long. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day caught up with us, and Caleb's head started to droop, his eyes fluttering shut. He leaned into me, his weight pressing against my side, and I wrapped an arm around him instinctively, pulling him closer. "You're tired," I murmured, my lips brushing against the top of his head. He hummed in agreement, his voice heavy with sleep. "Stay with me." It wasn't a request this time, it was a statement, a quiet plea that he didn't feel the need to explain. And again, I found myself unable to deny him. "Yeah," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." He smiled at that, a small, content smile that made my chest ache in a way I couldn't quite explain. And then, with a soft sigh, he drifted off to sleep, his breathing slow and steady against my chest. I sat there for a long time, holding him as he slept, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't seem to quiet. The line between us, the one that had always been so clear, so defined, was blurring, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to cross it. But then again, maybe I already had. The room was quiet now, the only sound the soft hum of the TV in the background. Caleb's body was warm against mine, his head resting on my shoulder, his breath tickling my neck. I could feel the rise and fall of his chest with each breath, a steady rhythm that lulled me into a sense of calm I hadn't felt in a long time. But beneath that calm, there was something else, something more that I couldn't ignore. It was there in the way he fit so perfectly against me, in the way his touch sent shivers racing through me, in the way his words lingered in my mind long after they were spoken. It was there, and it wasn't going away. I looked down at him, his face peaceful in sleep, and felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. "Is this what you want, Caleb?" I wondered. "Is this where we're headed?" I didn't have the answers, but as I sat there, holding him close, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was starting to figure it out. The TV flickered in the dimly lit room, casting shadows on the walls that danced and shifted with the changing scenes. Caleb stirred slightly in his sleep, his hand coming to rest on my thigh, his fingers curling around the fabric of my jeans. The touch was innocent, sleepy, and unconscious, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me anyway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart was pounding now, the rhythm fast and erratic, and I could feel the heat creeping up the back of my neck. I wanted to move, to pull away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I sat there, completely still, my eyes fixed on the hand resting on my leg. Julian, Caleb murmured sleepily, his voice soft and muffled against my shoulder. His fingers tightened slightly, as if he were trying to anchor himself to me, and I felt a wave of something more, wash over me. Yeah, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond, his breathing slow and steady, and I realized he was still asleep. But the sound of my name on his lips, even in sleep, was enough to make my stomach twist in knots. I sighed, leaning my head back against the couch and closing my eyes. What are we doing? I thought, the question echoing in my mind. What am I doing? I didn't know, and that scared me more than anything. But for now, I stayed there, holding him close, letting the warmth of his body chase away the doubts that lingered in the back of my mind. For now, this was enough. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. I blinked awake, my arm numb from the weight of Caleb's head resting on my chest. His breathing was slow and even, his body curled into mine in a way that felt both familiar and painfully new. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind a tangled mess of thoughts. This is wrong, isn't it? The question gnawed at me, but the way Caleb's warmth seeped into my skin made it hard to hold on to the doubt. I carefully shifted, trying not to wake him, but he stirred anyway, his eyes fluttering open. Morning, he mumbled, his voice groggy but soft, a small smile playing on his lips. His hand slid up my chest, fingers brushing against my collarbone in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. Morning, I replied, my voice rough from sleep. I cleared my throat, trying to ignore the way my heart sped up at the look in his eyes. Those eyes that had always been so open, so full of something I couldn't quite name until now. He propped himself up on one elbow, his gaze searching my face. Did you sleep okay? I nodded, though the truth was, I hadn't slept much at all. My mind had been racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, everything that was still happening. Yeah, I lied. You? Better than I have in a long time, he said, his voice low, almost intimate. His hand lingered on my chest, his thumb tracing small, absent-minded circles over my shirt. It's nice having you here like this. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Caleb, I started, but I didn't know what to say. How could I put into words the storm of emotions swirling inside me? The way his touch made my skin burn, the way his closeness felt like both a comfort and a threat to everything I thought I knew about us. Julian, he interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. I know this is complicated. I know you're still trying to figure things out, but I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to push you, but I'm not going to hide how I feel anymore either. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I stared at him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and something else, something I couldn't quite name, but that felt dangerously close to desire. Caleb, I said again, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if this is. You don't have to know, he said, cutting me off. His hand moved to my cheek, his palm warm against my skin. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just be here with me. That's all I'm asking. I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch despite the voice in the back of my head screaming that this was wrong, that this was crossing a line we could never come back from. But when I opened my eyes and saw the look on his face, the raw vulnerability, the quiet hope, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Okay, I whispered, the word feeling like both a surrender and a promise. His smile was small but genuine, and he leaned in, pressing his forehead against mine. Thank you, he murmured, his breath warm against my lips. We stayed like that for a moment, just breathing each other in, the silence between us charged with something unspoken. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, he tilted his head, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was so soft, so tentative, it made my chest ache. I kissed him back before I could stop myself, my hand coming up to cradle the back of his neck. It wasn't like the kiss from before. This was slower, more deliberate, as if we were both trying to memorize the feel of each other. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and when I felt the tip of his tongue brush against mine, a low groan escaped me before I could stifle it. Caleb, my brother. The thought should have been enough to make me pull away, but instead, it only made me kiss him harder, my fingers tangling in his hair. He moaned softly against my mouth, his body pressing closer to mine, and I could feel the way his heart was racing, matching the frantic pace of my own. We broke apart eventually, both of us breathing hard, our foreheads resting together. Julian, he whispered, his voice trembling. I I said, cutting him off. I didn't want to hear it, didn't want to give voice to whatever this was between us. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Let's just be here, okay? He nodded, his eyes searching mine for a moment before he leaned in again, pressing a chaste kiss to my lips. Okay, he agreed, his voice soft but firm. We stayed like that for a while, just holding each other, the silence between us comfortable but charged. Eventually, he pulled away, sitting up and stretching. I'm gonna make some coffee, he said, his voice light, as if nothing had happened. You want some? I nodded, watching as he stood and headed for the kitchen. I stayed on the couch, my mind reeling. What are we doing? I thought again, the question echoing in my head like a broken record. What am I doing? I didn't know. But as I heard the sound of Caleb humming softly in the kitchen, I couldn't help but feel like maybe, just maybe, it didn't matter. Maybe, for now, this was enough.